The atmosphere of the Lim penthouse is suffocating, smelling of expensive sandalwood, chilled scotch, and buried sins. Chantel Keyshawn stands by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her fingers trembling slightly against the stem of a crystal flute, as Lim Yun, the man the tabloids call the Silent Reaper, moves through the room behind her. Every measured footstep he takes on the polished obsidian floor seems to echo inside her chest. She shouldn't be here. She isn't just the doting wife of a syndicate king. She is a ticking time bomb. In her designer clutch lies a microtransmitter containing the week's drug shipments, and if the security team picks up the signal before she can kill it, the life she's built and the revenge she craves will go up in flames. Suddenly, the footsteps cease. A heavy silence settles over the room, and a long shadow stretches across the glass in front of her. "You've been quiet tonight, Chantel," a voice murmurs, low and vibrating like a distant storm. Chantel's heart hammers against her ribs. She keeps her eyes fixed on the city lights, terrified that the guilt swimming in her gaze will give her away. "Just admiring the view, Yun," she whispers. A warm, ink-covered hand slides around her waist, pulling her back against a chest of solid muscle, while the other tilts her head back to meet eyes that hold a lethal calm. In that moment, the air vanishes. He doesn't see a devoted partner. He sees a crack in the glass. And in Lim Yun's world, cracks are either mended with absolute possession or shattered into dust. The Grand Hyatt Seoul was a palace of glass and gold, but to Chantel, it felt like a high-tech cage. She moved through the gala with a practiced, regal grace, her hand tucked into the crook of Yun's arm. He was the picture of lethal calm in a bespoke tuxedo, his presence commanding a wide berth from the city's power brokers. To every onlooker, Chantel was the radiant jewel of the Lim Syndicate, but beneath the heavy silk of her emerald gown, a microtransmitter was taped to her inner thigh, pulsing against her skin like a second heartbeat. "You're tense," Yun murmured, his voice a low vibration that only she could hear. He didn't look at her. He remained focused on the chairman of a rival shipping firm, but his thumb traced a slow, possessive circle over the back of her hand. "The diamonds are too heavy tonight?" "Just a headache, Yun. The lights are a bit much," Chantel lied, her smile never wavering as she nodded to a passing diplomat. Every second counted. Her handler had designated the drop-off point in the third-floor powder room, a dead drop behind a loose ventilation grate. She had a 4-minute window before the FBI signal scrambler timed out. If she missed it, the encrypted files on Yun's latest offshore acquisitions would remain trapped in her purse, and her handler's patience was already wearing thin. "I'll be back in a moment," she whispered, leaning in to brush a kiss against his cheek. She felt the slight tension in his jaw, the way he always seemed to lean into her light. "Don't be long," he replied, his eyes finally meeting hers. For a terrifying beat, his gaze searched hers with a haunting intensity, as if he could see the wires and the lies beneath the surface. "The world is less interesting when you aren't standing in my shadow." She broke away, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She moved through the crowd with surgical precision, slipping into the elevator just as the doors hissed shut. In the privacy of the mirrored car, her poker face cracked. She exhaled a shaky breath, her fingers fumbling with the clasp of her clutch. Inside the powder room, the air was cold. She worked quickly, her heels clicking on the marble as she reached for the grate. She slid the transmitter into the dark void, hearing the faint click of the magnetic seal. It was done. But as she turned to leave, the door opened. Yun stood there, framed by the opulent hallway, his hands in his pockets. He wasn't angry, he was silent, watching her with a stillness that made the oxygen leave the room. "The powder room on the second floor is closer, Chantel," he said softly. He walked toward her, his ink-covered hand brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "Why do you always prefer the long way?" The ride back to the penthouse was a suffocating vacuum. Yoon didn't mention the third-floor powder room again, but his silence was louder than a confession. He sat with his legs crossed, staring out at the blurred neon of Seoul, his hand resting on the seat between them, close enough for Chantel to feel his heat, but far enough to signify a growing chasm. When the car veered away from their home and toward the industrial docks of Incheon, Chantel's blood turned to ice. "We have a detour," Yoon said, his voice as flat as the Black Sea. The warehouse smelled of salt, rust, and the metallic tang of fear. As they stepped inside, the limb gathered snapped to attention, their shadows elongated by the harsh overhead floodlights. In the center of the room, a man was tied to a chair. Minho, one of the junior bookkeepers Chantel had used to verify the shipment logs 3 months ago. He was beaten, his breath a wet rattle, but his eyes widened with a desperate, silent plea when they landed on Chantel. Yoon didn't look at the prisoner. He stepped behind Chantel, his presence a heavy shroud, and placed his hands on her shoulders. His thumbs pressed into her collarbones, grounding her, while his lethal calm radiated through the silk of her dress. "Someone has been siphoning data, Chantel," Yoon whispered against her ear, his breath warm and terrifying. Minho was found with a secondary phone. He claims he was forced into it. Chantel's stomach lurched. Minho was innocent. He was a scapegoat, a distraction she had planted weeks ago to lead the FBI's trail away from herself. She watched as Yoon's head of security handed him a suppressed pistol. Yoon didn't take it. Instead, he reached around Chantel, his arm brushing hers, and guided her hand to the weapon. "A queen must know how her empire is defended," he murmured, his fingers interlaced with hers, forcing her to feel the cold weight of the steel. The pressure of his body against her back was a paradox of protection and threat. He was testing her. He wanted to see if she would flinch, if she would cry, if she would betray a hint of the poker face she had spent years perfecting. "Do it, Chantel," he urged, his voice dropping to a seductive, lethal rasp. Chantel looked into Minho's weeping eyes. Her heart was a frantic bird in a cage, but she let her expression go stone cold. She realized then that Yoon didn't just want her to watch. He wanted her to be stained by his world, to be so deep in the blood that the FBI would never take her back. She felt his finger tighten over hers on the trigger. In the hollow silence of the warehouse, the exclusive gentleness was gone. There was only the boss, his wife, and the blood in the water. The penthouse was a tomb of glass, the city lights below offering a cold electric glow that didn't reach the shadows of the master suite. The scent of gunpowder still clung to Chantel's hair, a ghost of the warehouse that no amount of expensive soap could wash away. She sat on the edge of the sprawling bed, her hands still trembling beneath the silk of her robe. The execution, the way Yoon had guided her finger on the trigger, had been a baptism in fire, leaving her scorched and hollow. The heavy door clicked shut. Yoon didn't turn on the lights. He moved through the darkness with his characteristic lethal calm, discarding his jacket and tie until he stood before her in the charcoal dimness. He sat behind her on the bed, his knees framing her hips, and began to slowly undo the ties of her robe. Chantel froze, her breath hitching, waiting for the interrogation she was certain was coming. Instead, he pulled her back against his bare chest. For the first time, he let her see the ink he guarded so fiercely. In the moonlight, the tattoos that climbed his back and shoulders looked like living shadows, dragons, falling petals, and jagged scripts that seemed to bleed into his skin. "They ask me why I hide them," he whispered, his voice a low, vibrating rasp against her ear. He took her hand, his fingers interlaced with hers, and guided her touch to a thick, raised scar that ran through the center of a snarling tiger on his ribs. "They think it's about the law or the image of a businessman. It isn't." He turned her in his arms until they were eye to eye. The intensity in his gaze was no longer haunting. It was raw, a stripped-back vulnerability that made Chantel's throat tight with unshed tears. "In our world, Chantel, every mark is a story of a loss," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with an exclusive gentleness that felt like a knife to her heart. "I hide them because I don't want the world to know where I've been broken. I hide them because I wanted one part of me to be clean. For you." He leaned his forehead against hers, his scent of sandalwood and skin enveloping her. "I know there is a shadow in this house, Chantel. I know the walls are listening. But when I am with you, I imagine I am just a man, and you are just my wife. Not a boss, not a queen. Just us." Chantel felt the weight of her transmitter, hidden in the vanity drawer, pressing against her conscience like a mountain. For 3 years, she had viewed him as a target, a monster to be dismantled. But as he held her, his heart beating a steady, honest rhythm against her palm, the mission felt like the true monster. She wasn't just a spy anymore. She was a woman falling for the man she was supposed to destroy. And for the first time, she doubted if she could ever pull the trigger again. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, but the light felt clinical, stripping away the intimacy of the night before. Yoon had left for the shipyard before dawn, leaving Chantel alone with the ghost of his confession and the cold reality of her treason. She sat in the breakfast nook, a cup of untasted tea cooling in front of her, when her secondary phone vibrated in the hidden compartment of her silk robe. It was a burner app, the interface stark and demanding. Her handler, Agent Miller, didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You missed the secondary uplink last night, Keyshawn," the text read, the words appearing and vanishing like smoke. "The director is breathing down my neck. We need the final shipment manifests for the Incheon route. Now." Chantel's fingers hovered over the glass. "The estate is on lockdown," she typed back, her heart stuttering. "Yoon executed a bookkeeper yesterday. He's hunting a mole. I need to go dark for 48 hours. The reply was instantaneous, and it carried a chill that the Lim Syndicate's coldest hitmen couldn't match. "You don't have 48 hours. You have 12. If those manifests aren't on our server by midnight, we're pulling your protection. We'll leak your consultant profile to the Lim security chief. Let's see how gentle your husband is when he finds out he's been sleeping with a federal wire for 3 years." Chantel gasped, the phone slipping from her hand onto the velvet chair. The betrayal stung more than the threat. She had given the Bureau 3 years of her life, risked her neck in the heart of a criminal empire to avenge her brother, and now they were holding her life over a flame to meet a quota. They didn't care about justice. They cared about the bust. She looked around the room, the hand-carved furniture, the art Yoon had bought because she had glanced at it once in a gallery, the sheer luxury of a life built on a foundation of blood and lies. If Miller followed through, the lethal calm she had seen in Yoon would turn toward her. She pictured his ink-covered hands, the hands that had held her with such reverence hours ago, wrapping around her throat. The pressure was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. She was trapped between two monsters, the one who loved her in the dark, and the one who used her in the light. Chantel stood up, her gaze hardening as she looked toward Yoon's private study. She had 12 hours to decide if she was a patriot or a wife. But as she moved toward the heavy oak doors, she realized the line between the two had finally snapped. The silence of Yoon's private study was absolute, a heavy shroud that seemed to muffle the sound of Chantel's own frantic pulse. The air here was cooler, smelling of old leather and the faint metallic tang of the high-security vault recessed into the floor beneath the heavy mahogany desk. 12 hours were ticking away, and Agent Miller's threat hung over her like a guillotine. She knelt on the obsidian floor, her fingers flying across the keypad. She knew the code. It was the date they had met, a detail Yoon had offered with a shy, rare smile months ago. The heavy steel door hissed open with a hydraulic sigh, revealing rows of ledgers and encrypted drives. Chantel reached for the manifest she had been ordered to steal, but her hand stopped when she saw a weathered manila folder tucked into the back corner. It was labeled in Yoon's precise, elegant script. Project Red Kite, the Keyshawn case. Her breath hitched. She opened the folder expecting to find the order for her brother's execution. Instead, she found a series of grainy surveillance photos. In every shot, her brother wasn't being hunted by the Lim Syndicate. He was being shielded by them. There were transcripts of intercepted calls between Yoon and her brother, discussing a departure plan to get him out of the country after he had uncovered a massive embezzlement scheme within the FBI's regional office. The final document was a ballistics report from a cold case file. The bullet that had ended her brother's life hadn't come from a syndicate weapon. It was a government-issue .40 caliber, the signature round of the very team Agent Miller led. The room seemed to tilt. The foundation of her 3-year mission shattered into dust. Yoon hadn't been the monster she was sent to destroy. He had been the man trying to save her family from the true predators. Every piece of intel she had fed to Miller hadn't been for justice. It had been to help the Bureau clean up its loose ends by eliminating the only man who knew the truth. You weren't supposed to see that yet. The low, vibrating rasp of Yoon's voice made her spin around. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the golden light of the hallway. He didn't have a weapon drawn. He didn't look like the silent reaper. He looked weary, his eyes reflecting a profound, haunting sadness. "I've been waiting for you to ask me, Chantel," he murmured, walking slowly into the room. He stopped just inches away, the scent of sandalwood and winter air enveloping her.
I've been waiting for you to realize that the people who sent you to my bed are the same ones who put your brother in the ground." Chantel looked at the man she had betrayed, then at the folder in her trembling hands. The lethal calm she had once feared was now the only thing keeping her from screaming. She realized then that she wasn't just a spy who had fallen in love. She was a woman who had been weaponized against her own heart.
The walls of the penthouse felt as though they were physically contracting, the air thick with the scent of unspent lightning. In the center of the grand dining room, the heavy oak table was surrounded by the syndicate's most ruthless captains. Yoon sat at the head, his lethal calm, a frozen mask of stone, while Chantel stood beside him. Her hand rested on the back of his chair, her fingers grazing the fine wool of his jacket, but the connection felt like a wire pulled to the snapping point. Ji-hoon, the head of security, a man who had always looked at Chantel with the cold eyes of a butcher, stepped forward. He placed a silver tablet on the table, the blue light of the screen casting a ghoulish pallor over his features. "We've found the leak, boss," Ji-hoon said, his voice a jagged rasp of triumph. "The encryption isn't from a rival syndicate. It's federal. It's been coming from inside this room." A low, guttural murmur rippled through the captains. Chantel's heart didn't just race, it thrashed against her ribs. She felt the weight of the file she had found in the vault, the proof of her brother's true killers, burning a hole in her memory. She looked at Yoon, but his profile remained unreadable, his gaze fixed on the digital log scrolling across the screen. "Go on," Yoon commanded, the words barely a whisper. The transmissions coincide with every gala, every private shipment, and every moment the lady was left unattended. Ji-hoon continued, his finger hovering over a map of the penthouse. The signal originated from the master suite. It was a deep cover transmitter, masked by our own security frequencies. There was only one person with the access and the proximity to plant it. Ji-hoon turned, his eyes locking onto Chantel with predatory hunger. Chantel Kishan, the FBI's silent partner. The silence that followed was deafening. The captains shifted, hands moving toward the hidden holsters beneath their jackets. The exclusive gentleness that usually filled the space between Yoon and Chantel evaporated, replaced by a vacuum of pure, unadulterated danger. Chantel didn't flinch. She leaned into the fire, her hand tightening on Yoon's chair until her knuckles were white. "If you have proof, Ji-hoon, show it," Chantel said, her voice a low, vibrating chime of defiance. "Or are you so desperate to cover your own failures that you'd point at the queen?" Ji-hoon sneered, tapping the screen to reveal a grainy image of Chantel in the Hyatt powder room, her hand reaching for the ventilation grate. It was the crack in the glass Yoon had warned her about. Yoon stood up slowly, the movement so fluid it was terrifying. The temperature in the room plummeted. He didn't look at Ji-hoon. He turned to Chantel, his ink-covered hand rising to cup her jaw. His thumb traced her lip with a tenderness that felt like a death sentence. "Is it true, Chantel?" he asked, his voice cracking with a raw, jagged heartbreak that shattered her more than any thread could. "Did you bring the wolves into our home?" The sky over the Incheon cliffs had finally broken, weeping a cold, torrential rain that blurred the line between the gray sea and the black horizon. The engine of the black sedan ticked as it cooled, the only sound in the desolate stretch of land, except for the rhythmic roar of the waves crashing against the rocks far below. Yoon stood at the very edge of the precipice, his back to Chantel. The wind whipped his white shirt against his frame, the fabric turning translucent in the downpour, revealing the dark, writhing shadows of his tattoos beneath. He looked less like a man and more like a part of the storm, primal, jagged, and ready to break. Chantel stepped out of the car, the mud clinging to her heels, her evening silk ruined. She didn't try to run. There was nowhere to go, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't want to hide. "Ji-hoon wanted to bleed you in the basement," Yoon said, his voice carrying over the wind, devoid of his usual lethal calm. It was hollow, a sound of absolute ruin. He turned slowly, his face slick with rain, his eyes bloodshot. "I just wanted to know if a single touch was real." He reached into his waistband and pulled out his service weapon, the heavy steel glinting in the dull light. Chantel's breath hitched, but she stood her ground. He walked toward her, the distance closing until the barrel of the gun was pressed firmly against her sternum. "The FBI killed my brother, Yoon," she screamed over the thunder, the words finally tearing out of her. "They sent me to find his killer, and it was them. Miller, he's the one who pulled the trigger. I have the ballistics. I have the files." Yoon's hand didn't shake, but his expression fractured. He looked down at the gun between them, then back at her face. "I know," he whispered, a sound so soft it nearly disappeared in the gale. "I've known since the day you walked into the Hyatt. I let you stay. I let you lie. I let you transmit every shipment and every route because I hoped that one day you would see me instead of the target." He flipped the gun in his hand, holding it by the barrel, and pressed the grip into her palm. He leaned forward until his forehead rested against hers, his scent of sandalwood mixing with the brine of the sea. "If the mission is still alive, Chantel, finish it," he commanded, his voice a raw, desperate rasp. "If I am the monster you were promised, take the shot. But if you're my wife, if you're the woman who held me in the dark, then you need to decide who dies today, because the FBI is coming, and I won't go back to a cage." Chantel looked at the weapon, then at the man who was offering her his life as a final act of devotion. The poker face was gone, washed away by the rain, leaving only the truth of a woman who had finally found home in the heart of her enemy. The gun felt like a block of ice in Chantel's hand, but her heart was a furnace. She didn't point the weapon at Yoon. She pointed it at the crashing waves, the sound of the discharge swallowed by a well-timed crack of thunder. 2 shots, one for the lie and one for the life she was leaving behind. Yoon caught her as she collapsed, not out of weakness, but as part of the choreographed tragedy they were staging for the thermal optics he knew were watching from the distant tree line. He smeared a capsule of theatrical blood across her white silk dress, the crimson stain blossoming like a dark flower in the rain. To the FBI surveillance team miles away, the silent Reaper had just executed his informant wife. "Stay still," Yoon breathed, his voice a low, vibrating rasp against her ear as he bundled her limp body into the back of the car. "The tracker in your dress will go dead in 60 seconds. When it does, you cease to exist." The drive back toward the city was a blur of high-speed precision. They didn't go to the penthouse. They descended into the bowels of a derelict shipyard, the very place where Agent Miller expected to find Yoon's primary server hub. It was the honeypot, a digital trap laced with the very evidence Miller was desperate to erase. Chantel sat up in the back seat, shedding the blood-soaked silk to reveal a tactical suit of matte black. She looked at Yoon, who was checking the action on his rifle with that haunting, lethal calm. The man who had memorized how she took her tea was gone. In his place was the architect of a massacre. "Miller will lead the tactical team himself," Chantel said, her voice steady as she strapped a holster to her thigh. "He won't let anyone else touch the drive that has his name on it." "Then he is already dead," Yoon replied. He reached over, his ink-covered hand cupping the back of her neck, pulling her into a kiss that tasted of salt and desperation. It was a promise, a seal on their new, bloody covenant. "He thought he sent a lamb into my bed, Chantel. He didn't realize he was sending me a partner." The shipyard was silent as the FBI's black SUVs rolled in, their headlights cutting through the fog like the eyes of predators. Miller stepped out, a smug silhouette of government-sanctioned murder, unaware that the dead woman was watching him through a high-powered scope from the rafters above. Chantel didn't feel the Stockholm Syndrome she had once feared. She felt a cold, crystalline clarity. She tapped her earpiece, her voice a ghost in the frequency Miller thought was secure. "Checkmate, Miller." As the first flashbang detonated, turning the shipyard into a crucible of white light, Chantel and Yoon moved as one. The great escape wasn't away from the violence. It was into the heart of it, where they would bury the past under the weight of the truth. The smoke from the shipyard had long since cleared, replaced by the crisp, sterile air of a new dawn. High above the city, the penthouse windows no longer felt like the bars of a cage, but like the visor of a helmet, surveying a kingdom that had been purged by fire. Chantel stood at the center of the room, draped in a gown of obsidian silk that moved like liquid shadow. She was no longer the jewel of the Lim Syndicate, a pretty thing to be protected and kept in the dark. She was the architect. Beside her, the primary server hummed, now wiped of the FBI's backdoors and reinforced with the encryption she had spent years mastering. Every file that could have destroyed Yoon had been turned into a weapon against the remnants of the corrupt bureau office. Miller was gone, his legacy buried under the weight of the evidence she had planted in his own dead drop. The heavy doors slid open, and Yoon entered. He had shed his tactical gear for a sharp charcoal suit, but he didn't wear the lethal calm he presented to the world. When his eyes found Chantel, they softened into that exclusive gentleness reserved only for her. He walked to her side, his presence a grounding heat, and placed his hand over hers on the marble console. "The captains are waiting," he murmured, his voice a low, vibrating rasp of pride. "They know the truth now. They know it wasn't a rat they were living with, but a savior." Chantel looked at her reflection in the glass. The poker face was gone, replaced by a crystalline resolve. She had spent 3 years trying to dismantle this empire, only to realize that with the right heart at its center, it was the only place she was truly safe. She wasn't just his wife, she was his equal, the mind that would guide his hand. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, a silent oath passing between them in the quiet of the morning. The mission was over, the revenge was complete, and the lies had been burned away. As they walked toward the grand hall to face their subjects, Chantel realized that the blow your mind ending wasn't the betrayal or the blood. It was the fact that a spy and a monster had found the only thing more powerful than the law, a loyalty that began in a lie and ended in an empire. The queen had risen, and this time the world would be the one to watch its step.